Hey guys, tonight we begin with candles, cold stone walls, and the sound of way too many rats scuttling under the floorboards. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if you somehow landed here because you typed how to fall asleep into YouTube and didn't realise you were about to learn far more than you ever needed about medieval pillowcases. Don't worry, you're in the right place. Tonight we'll take a slow walk through the world of medieval women and what they did before bed. Spoiler, it's not that exciting. Which is good because you're here to sleep, not to stay up wide-eyed wondering if a baroness is about to storm the castle. So dim your lights, pull your blanket a little tighter, and let's drift into the very glamorous and very drafty world of medieval bedtime. Now, medieval women didn't exactly live in a world of scented candles and silk pyjamas from Target. No, their nights ended with wooden shutters, scratchy wool, and the occasional bout of plague. But as always, daily life was full of small rituals, some strangely sweet, some weirdly sad, and some so baffling you almost want to say, of course they did that. Let's start with the basics, the bed itself. If you were lucky enough to be wealthy, you might have something called a great bed. A huge carved wooden contraption covered in tapestries, cushions and furs. It looked impressive, but in reality it was more about showing off than sleeping comfortably. Think of it as the medieval version of an Instagram flex. The bigger the bed, the better you looked. Never mind that it was stuffed with straw that smelled faintly of goat. For most ordinary women, though, bedtime meant a simple straw mattress, maybe stuffed with hay or reeds. And let's be honest, after a day of spinning, weaving, cooking, hauling water, and trying not to die of boredom, you weren't exactly picky about thread counts. Now, before you could actually lie down, you had to prepare yourself. Medieval women, especially the wealthier ones, had routines. Not skincare routines exactly, but let's just say they were trying. Hair care was a whole event. Long hair was considered beautiful, and most women wore it braided or covered with a veil during the day. At night, you might unbraid it, brush it out with a wooden comb and apply a bit of oil or herbs if you were fancy. Rosemary water, vinegar rinses, or even beer were common. Yes, beer. Imagine going to bed smelling like an alehouse and rosemary sprig combo platter. Very relaxing. But don't think this was just about vanity. Hair was tied to virtue, status, and sometimes even religion. Some women covered their hair to show piety. Others let it flow loose at night, because, well, nobody but your husband and the housemaid polishing your candlestick was supposed to see it anyway. Speaking of candlesticks, lighting was minimal. Once the sun went down, your options were a candle, an oil lamp, or sitting in complete darkness. Candles weren't cheap, so ordinary families used them sparingly. A noble woman, though, might have a whole room glowing with beeswax candles, which not only looked rich but smelled better than the usual animal fat tallow version that made your bedroom smell like a sizzling steakhouse. Now, let's drift a little deeper into hygiene rituals, or as medieval people called it, trying their best with what they had. Contrary to the stereotype, medieval women did wash, but not with the daily hot showers we're used to. Bathing was more occasional, often weekly or less, depending on your status. Before bed, you might at least wash your face, hands and feet. A basin of water, sometimes scented with herbs like lavender or chamomile, was enough to take the day's grime off before climbing into bed. If you were wealthy, you could even have heated water brought to you, luxury defined. For poorer women, water was often cold, pulled from a well, and more of a quick splash than a soothing ritual. Imagine ending your day with a bucket of icy well water. Romantic, right? And then there was nightwear. Pyjamas didn't exist. Most women slept in their chemise, the simple linen underdress they wore all day anyway. Linen was considered healthy, breathable, and easy to wash, which was a big deal. If you were wealthier, maybe your chemise was embroidered or made from finer fabric. If not, it was plain, practical, and scratchy. In colder months, furs or wool blankets were piled on top to keep warm, because medieval heating was basically, Here's a fireplace. Good luck. Now, let's float over to another nightly ritual, prayer. Religion was the Netflix of the Middle Ages. Everyone did it daily, often before bed. Women might kneel by their bed or say prayers silently under their breath. Wealthy women sometimes owned books of hours, lavishly decorated prayer books that doubled as bedtime reading material. Poorer women just had memorized prayers, often whispered quickly before collapsing into sleep. Prayer wasn't just spiritual, it was also a way of asking for protection from the many, many dangers of the night. Fire, thieves, demons, bad dreams, you name it. The medieval night was scary, and a little prayer never hurt. And speaking of scary, let's not forget superstitions. Medieval women had plenty of bedtime rituals designed to ward off the creepy stuff. A sprig of herbs under the pillow to prevent nightmares. A charm or relic nearby for protection. Some even believed sleeping in certain positions could prevent evil spirits from creeping into your dreams. Imagine ending your day thinking, better sleep on my right side, or demons will get me. Cozy. Meanwhile, elite women had other nighttime concerns, like whether their bedchamber was private. In castles and manors, privacy wasn't guaranteed. Servants often slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, especially if you needed attendance at night. Royal and noble women might share their sleeping space with ladies-in-waiting, guards, or even their children. Forget the image of the lonely princess in a grand bedchamber. Real medieval bedrooms were basically a group sleepover, but with more wool blankets and less popcorn. Of course, there were also the, let's say, marital duties. For married women, bedtime wasn't always restful. Producing heirs was basically a full-time job requirement for noble women, and nighttime was when that duty was expected to be carried out. Whether she was in the mood or not wasn't exactly the point. For peasant women, it was simpler, but not necessarily less exhausting. Small houses, shared beds, and zero privacy meant intimacy was less romantic candlelight and more try not to wake the kids. Finally, let's talk about storytelling. Before sleep, women, especially mothers, often told stories or sang lullabies. These weren't always the fairy tales we know today. They could be religious parables, moral lessons, or folk tales about saints, demons, or trickster animals. Comforting, right? Good night, sweet child, and don't let the devil take you in your sleep. Medieval parenting at its finest. And with that, we've set the stage for the nightly world of medieval women. Bed stuffed with straw, hair dripping in rosemary beer, whispered prayers, and just a dash of demon avoidance. Let's float now into the more specific and stranger rituals that took place once the candles burned low. Alright, so we've set the mood. Straw beds, rosemary beer hair rinse, and whispered prayers to avoid midnight demons. Now let's float into the bedrooms of women with a little more rank. Queens, princesses, duchesses, and ladies who are supposed to represent the pinnacle of medieval refinement. Spoiler, their nights weren't always that refined. Let's begin with the obvious. Royal bedrooms were not private, at all. You might picture a medieval queen drifting off in a massive canopied bed, swathed in silk sheets, with a roaring fire keeping her cozy. And, yes, sometimes that happened. But usually the room had attendants, ladies in waiting, sometimes guards, and occasionally the odd scribe hanging around. It was less romantic solitude, and more, you're the queen, and 10 people are watching you brush your teeth with twigs. Privacy wasn't considered necessary for the elite. In fact, being watched was part of the point. Royalty lived their lives publicly, even their bedtime routines. A queen's attendants helped with everything, unpinning elaborate hairstyles, removing jewelled gowns, and getting her into her night chemise. Even climbing into bed could be ceremonial. The queen would be put to bed by a few trusted ladies, who tucked her in as if she was some kind of royal toddler. And if the king happened to be joining her, well, sometimes that was a public event too. Yes, in certain courts, the marriage bed was witnessed, because nothing says sleep tight like having your political advisors lurking in the background making sure you and your spouse are doing your dynastic duty. Sleepy, romantic, and deeply awkward. Now, let's pause to appreciate the beds themselves in noble homes. These weren't just beds. They were status symbols covered in carved wood, velvet drapes and embroidered pillows. The canopy wasn't just decorative, it was practical. It kept out drafts, falling bugs, and the occasional bird that wandered into the rafters. Because yes, if your ceiling was basically just beams and thatch, nature was part of your bedroom decor. One queen who had a particularly famous bedtime was Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Isabella was supposed to be the picture of medieval queenliness, but her marriage was a nightmare. Edward preferred the company of his male favourites, and Isabella didn't exactly get the bedtime attention she signed up for. Instead of cosy conjugal routines, she often ended her night stewing in political resentment. Eventually she staged a coup and had Edward deposed. Moral of the story: ignore your queen at bedtime long enough, and she might overthrow you. Speaking of marital disasters, let's drift over to Margaret of Anjou, another Queen of England. She married Henry VI, a man who basically spent half his reign in a dreamlike fugue state. Not in the good bedtime way, more in the is the king awake or catatonic today kind of way. For Margaret, bedtime meant dealing with a husband who wasn't really functioning. While he retreated into his bedchamber, she picked up the political slack. Imagine trying to fall asleep while planning the next military campaign because your husband checked out mentally. Relaxing, right? But not all bedtime stories were sad. Sometimes they were just weird. Take Anne of Brittany, twice Queen of France. Anne had an obsession with preserving her dignity, even in bed. She reportedly slept in her crown on certain ceremonial occasions, because nothing says comfortable sleep like a giant metal hat crushing your skull. Now let's drift away from queens and into the world of noble women in general. Their bedtime rituals often involve not only personal grooming but also household management. A lady might spend her last waking moments giving instructions to servants, managing supplies, or making sure her estates weren't collapsing into chaos. Bedtime wasn't just personal, it was administrative. Think of it as answering work emails in bed, except instead of Gmail, it was your steward muttering about grain shortages. For noble girls, bedtime could be especially strict. Young women were often supervised by older attendants to ensure chastity. They might be locked into their rooms, or even their beds, with a contraption called a chastity belt. Though historians argue whether those belts were really common or more of a later myth. The fear of teenage daughters doing anything unsupervised was very real. Sweet dreams indeed. And then there were the medical beliefs about sleep. Doctors in the Middle Ages had plenty of opinions, most of them not great. Women were told not to eat too much before bed, or it would cause unwholesome vapours to rise into the brain, producing nightmares or even insanity. Pregnant women were warned not to sleep on their backs, because apparently that encouraged the fetus to strangle itself with the umbilical cord. Comforting advice. For noble women especially, sleep was also tied to beauty. The idea of beauty sleep is ancient. Women were advised to get enough rest to preserve their complexions, and to sleep on their back so their faces wouldn't wrinkle against the pillow. Some used creams of honey, milk or animal fat as part of their nightly skincare, so they went to bed smelling like a medieval breakfast buffet. And let's not forget the dream culture of the Middle Ages. Dreams weren't just nonsense, they were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, and sometimes from the last piece of mouldy bread you ate. Noble women might consult dream books, which gave interpretations for different nighttime visions. Dream of losing a tooth, someone's going to die, dream of water, a journey ahead, dream of being chased by a goat. Well, good luck. Of course, not all noble women were tucked in safely at night. Some spent their evenings in prayer vigils, especially if they were widows or particularly pious. Sleeping less was sometimes considered holy. So while peasants collapsed into bed after a day of labour, elite women might deliberately stay awake muttering prayers while trying not to pass out. So, when you imagine a medieval noblewoman before bed, picture less of a glamorous Disney princess scene and more of a tired administrator/fashion model/reluctant political operator collapsing under a canopy while 5 attendants hovered nearby. And with that, let's drift even further down the social ladder, where ordinary medieval women had their own nighttime quirks. Alright, so we've wandered through royal chambers stuffed with velvet and resentment. Now let's drop all that luxury and step into a far more common bedroom. The cottage, the farmhouse, the one-room hut where most medieval women actually ended their day. First thing to notice, space, or rather, the lack of it. For peasants, the entire family often lived, cooked, ate and slept in 1 or 2 rooms. Privacy wasn't a concept, unless you counted pulling a blanket over your head and pretending you couldn't hear your uncle snoring in the corner. Beds? Sometimes there wasn't even a separate bed at all. Families might sleep on straw pallets directly on the floor. If you were lucky, maybe you had a wooden frame stuffed with straw, wool or feathers, though the feathers usually belonged to people wealthier than you. For most, it was straw, and you changed it out when it got too gross, which, given medieval hygiene, was probably sooner than you'd think. So before bed, an ordinary medieval woman often had to arrange the sleeping area. Shake out the straw, spread a blanket, maybe add a sheepskin if it was winter. Beds weren't just for sleeping either. During the day, they doubled as benches or storage space. At night, you'd roll out the bedding like a medieval futon. And the sleeping arrangements? Very communal. Families often slept together for warmth, because central heating was not a thing, and a fireplace in the corner only helped so much. Parents, children, sometimes even servants all huddled under the same blanket. Romantic, right? Nothing says cosy like your toddler kicking you in the face while your mother-in-law coughs in the background. Now, before actually lying down, peasant women had chores. And yes, the day's work didn't end when the sun went down. Fetching water, feeding animals, tidying the hearth, preparing tomorrow's dough, these were often wrapped up in the dim glow of a single candle. Going to bed early wasn't always a choice. With no artificial light, once darkness fell, your productivity dropped. Unless you wanted to risk burning down your thatched roof by leaving the candle unattended. As for nightwear, forget embroidered chemises. Ordinary women usually went to bed in whatever linen shift they wore during the day. The idea of changing into pyjamas was basically non-existent. If it was freezing, you might add extra layers, or just pile on every blanket you owned. Medieval advice books even recommended sleeping with a hat on. So, yes, bedtime fashion often looked like linen sack dress plus nightcap. Now, here's a charming detail: bed sharing with animals. In small cottages, livestock were often brought indoors for the night. Chickens, goats, even pigs might share your living space. Why? Because warmth. So when we say cosy medieval bedtime, remember, sometimes it included a chicken roosting near your pillow. Nothing like a rooster crowing at 3 a.m. to lull you to sleep. And of course, there were bedtime superstitions. Peasant women leaned heavily on charms and folk practices to protect their families at night. Maybe you tucked a sprig of rue or St. John's wort under the pillow to ward off nightmares. Maybe you drew a cross on the bed with chalk just in case wandering spirits were feeling frisky. Mothers especially worried about their children, so cradles often had protective carvings or religious tokens attached. Because in a world of high infant mortality, you weren't taking any chances with goblins, or germs, though they didn't know that word yet. Speaking of children, bedtime for medieval women often meant getting kids to sleep, which was just as chaotic as it is today. Lullabies were common, though the lyrics weren't always as gentle as modern ones. Some were about saints, others about moral lessons, and some were basically veiled threats to behave, or else. Sweet dreams, little one. Now let's talk about food before bed, because medieval medical theory had opinions. Doctors warned against eating heavy meals late in the day, since digestion supposedly heated the body and interfered with sleep. But in reality, peasants often ate their largest meal at night after work was done. So bedtime could mean lying down with a belly full of bread, cheese, and maybe some pottage, a kind of endless stew. Not exactly light on the stomach, but when your calories came from survival farming, you weren't skipping supper. And then there was the curfew bell. In many towns, a bell rang at dusk, signalling people to put out their fires before bed. It was partly a fire prevention measure, and partly a way of saying, "All right, peasants, bedtime now." The French word couvre-feu, cover fire, eventually gave us the word curfew. So for women, bedtime often began with literally smothering the hearth fire so your house didn't go up in flames overnight. Nighttime also meant vulnerability. Thieves, wolves, disease, even supernatural fears all crept in once the sun set. For ordinary women, prayers before bed were as much about basic survival as spirituality. A whispered "protect my children, keep my house safe" carried more weight when the nearest guard patrol was a mile away, and the night was full of strange sounds. But despite the fears, there was also community comfort. Families slept close, often huddled together. Nighttime was when stories were told. Folk tales, family gossip, little lessons whispered in the dark. For many medieval women, bedtime wasn't just the end of the day. It was one of the rare times when family was gathered, quiet and still. So, yes, ordinary medieval bedtime was less glamorous candlelit rituals and more squeezing into a straw mattress with 3 kids and a goat. But in its own way, it was practical, cosy, and even a little tender. And as the candles guttered out and the curfew bell faded, medieval women, whether queens in silks or peasants in linen, finally drifted into sleep. Or at least tried to, until the rooster started again. So we've tucked the peasants in with their goats, and the queens under their embroidered canopies. But let's not forget, the medieval mind had a lot to say about sleep itself. Going to bed wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was wrapped up in medicine, religion, and enough weird theories to fill a very boring bedtime storybook. Let's start with the doctors. Medieval medicine was based on humours, the idea that your body was full of 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The key to health, supposedly, was keeping them balanced. What did this mean for bedtime? Well, doctors insisted you had to sleep in ways that kept your humours from sloshing around wrong. For example, sleeping on your left side was discouraged. Why? Because it was thought to overheat the liver, producing excess bile and nightmares. Sleeping on your back was risky too. It let vapours rise to the brain, causing visions, madness, or even sudden death. So the safest position? Your right side neatly curled up, like a medieval sleep safety manual. Doctors also said the best time to sleep was in the hours before midnight because that's when your body did the most repair work. Staying up too late was considered reckless, even sinful, since it made you vulnerable to bad thoughts, bad spirits, and bad digestion. So basically, medieval women were being told by their doctors to get 8 hours, sleep early, and watch their liver. Relatable. Now let's wander into the strange world of the 2 sleeps. Medieval people often didn't sleep in one solid block like we try to today. Instead, they followed a pattern called first sleep and second sleep. After the sun went down, women might sleep a few hours, wake up around midnight, then stay awake for an hour or 2 before going back to bed until dawn. What did they do during this midnight intermission? Lots of things. Pray, chat quietly, tend to small chores, check on the fire. Some use the time for intimacy, because nothing says romance like, "Hey honey, it's 1 a.m. and the demons aren't around, you up?" Others used it for quiet reflection, or even dream interpretation. Imagine lying in bed at night, dissecting your dreams like a medieval Freud with a candle stub. Speaking of dreams, the dream culture was rich. Medieval women believed dreams had meaning, often sent by God or, less pleasantly, by demons. Entire dream manuals circulated giving handy interpretations. Dream of losing your hair? That meant financial ruin. Dream of baking bread. Prosperity ahead. Dream of being chased by pigs. Well, good luck with that. Dreams weren't just personal, they could be political. Queens and noblewomen sometimes claimed divine dreams to justify decisions or prove they had heavenly approval. "I dreamt of a golden crown last night," said the Queen, and suddenly the court decided God was on her side. For peasant women, dreams were more practical, a way to explain daily anxieties, from bad harvest to sick children. Of course, not all dreams were welcome. Nightmares were considered dangerous, sometimes even supernatural attacks. The idea of the night hag, a demon or witch that sat on your chest while you slept, was common. Today we'd call it sleep paralysis, but back then it was proof that something spooky was trying to suffocate you. Women often put charms or religious symbols by the bed to ward these off, and then there were the herbal remedies for better sleep. Medieval women loved their plants. Chamomile was brewed as tea or stuffed into pillows to calm the nerves. Lavender was scattered in bedding to ward off insects and bad dreams. Valerian root was used as a sedative, though it smelled faintly like sweaty socks, so your bed might not have been the most inviting. Still, anything for a good night's rest. Some remedies were less appealing. Warm wine mixed with herbs was a common sleep aid, essentially the medieval version of NyQuil. And if you had serious insomnia, well, one recipe suggested rubbing a paste of lettuce juice and poppy seeds on your temples. Another said to cook a whole rooster, mix it with wine, and drink the broth before bed. Not exactly melatonin gummies, but the oddest piece of advice, don't think too much. Medieval doctors warned women that excessive thought before bed heated the brain, making it harder to sleep. So, yes, even in the 14th century, the advice was basically, stop overthinking and just go to bed. Easier said than done when your roof leaks, your children are sick and your goat won't shut up. Religious practices also shaped how women experienced sleep. Monastic women, like nuns, followed strict schedules that interrupted rest with nighttime prayers. The bell rang in the middle of the night and off they went to chant in a cold chapel. For them, lack of sleep wasn't a medical issue, it was a spiritual discipline. Ordinary women might not be so extreme, but bedtime prayers were universal. Some even blessed each body part before sleep, asking protection for their head, heart, hands and feet. So, between the humours, the dream books, the herbal teas, and the two-sleep schedule, medieval bedtime wasn't just lying down and calling it a day. It was a whole landscape of rituals, fears and small comforts. And with that, let's drift one step further, into the very weird world of royal meltdowns, insomnia, and the disastrous sleep habits of the most elite women in medieval Europe. So, peasants had their goats, nuns had their prayers, but what about the ladies in castles? You'd think royal women would drift off in luxury, wrapped in silk sheets, guarded by silence. But of course, being rich never made anything simple. Their nights were often some mix of excess, superstition, and mild misery. Let's start with the beds themselves. Noble women didn't just have mattresses. They had beds so enormous they were practically architectural structures. Think carved oak frames the size of small boats, layered with feather beds, wool blankets, furs, and embroidered covers. Curtains surrounded the bed to keep out draughts and, conveniently, to add a little privacy from the endless parade of servants. But those curtains weren't just for coziness. They were also for protection. Medieval castles were draughty, noisy, and, well, full of rats. So noble women would retreat into their curtained bed as if it were a private tent. Add a few scented herbs under the pillow, a warming pan full of hot coals slid between the sheets. Yes, actual hot metal under flammable fabric. Safety standards were not medieval strongpoints, and you've got yourself a royal sleep setup. Of course, even in these luxury cocoons, sleep wasn't guaranteed. Take Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England. Chroniclers described her as restless, plagued by anxieties about her unfaithful husband and his male favourites. Imagine lying awake in your bed-curtained fortress, listening to the gossip in the corridors, while your husband is off doting on his knights. Not exactly soothing. Or consider the Habsburg women, our favourite dynasty of inbreeding. Many of them were physically frail, and their doctors insisted on all kinds of weird bedtime treatments. Some were told to eat sugar-coated rose petals before bed. Others were encouraged to sleep with poultices of herbs tied to their stomachs to cool their overheated wombs. Because obviously your uterus dictated everything about your health. Then there's royal insomnia, a surprisingly common issue. Chroniclers loved to report when queens couldn't sleep, often blaming it on troubled consciences or sometimes witchcraft. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, supposedly used to pace the palace halls at night, unable to rest, convinced of conspiracies around her. Her servants must have adored those midnight wanderings. And of course, nothing screams luxury like the royal bedtime snack. Many noblewomen had their kitchens send up little treats to help them drift off. Wine mixed with honey, candied fruits, or spiced milk. It sounds lovely, except medieval digestion advice was constantly warning against eating late. So queens were essentially fueling insomnia with their midnight feasts. Sometimes bedtime got political. Noblewomen's beds were not always private. They could be audience chambers. The queen's bedroom was often where negotiations, gossip, and even small councils happened. Imagine trying to fall asleep knowing that at any moment someone might barge in to ask you about treaties, dowries, or taxes. Cosy. There were also the symbolic rituals. In France, the queen's bedtime was sometimes a semi-public affair, with ladies-in-waiting helping her undress and priests blessing her chamber. It was all meant to show her dignity and piety. In practice, it meant she had very little actual peace at night. Nothing like falling asleep with 10 people watching you climb into bed. Royal women also leaned heavily on astrology. Many wouldn't make decisions about when to sleep or even which side to lie on without consulting a court astrologer. If the stars said it was a bad night for rest, well, too bad, you stayed up. No wonder insomnia was rampant. And speaking of the stars, castle life could be oddly noisy at night. Guards tromped around, dogs barked in the courtyards, church bells rang at all hours for prayers. A noblewoman might find her grand four-poster bed less peaceful than a peasant's straw mat. At least peasants didn't have a cathedral bell tower chiming at 3 a.m. Let's not forget the luxury sleepwear. While peasants basically slept in their day clothes or a simple shift, noblewomen sometimes had nightgowns of silk, decorated with lace, or lined with fur for winter. Imagine climbing into bed dressed like a fashion show just to immediately fall asleep. And yes, jewellery was sometimes worn even in bed, especially religious charms or amulets for protection. But even with all the finery, royalty had their night terrors. Many queens were haunted by dreams of death, betrayal, or war. Chroniclers loved to write down these visions, often treating them as prophetic. One unlucky dream, and suddenly rumours flew about curses and omens. For a queen, bedtime wasn't just a rest. It was a stage where her subconscious became political theatre. And then there's the awkward reality. Medieval noblewomen didn't always sleep alone. Many were expected to share their beds with attendants, children, or even visitors. Bed sharing was common, both for warmth and for bonding. So while the queen technically had the fanciest bed in the land, she might be sharing it with her ladies-in-waiting or even political guests. Privacy was a luxury even silk curtains couldn't guarantee. So, while peasants worried about goats, queens worried about astrology charts, insomnia, and whether their warming pan would set the sheets on fire. Sleep was complicated at every level of society. And with that, let's gently drift to our final stretch. The way bedtime rituals shaped identity and memory. How these quiet, nightly routines tell us who medieval women really were. Behind all the titles and turbans and drafty castles. So here we are. We've peeked inside smoky cottages, wandered through cloisters, and tiptoed past velvet-draped royal beds. And now, as the medieval night grows quiet, let's pull the threads together. Because bedtime wasn't just about sleep. It was about who you were, how you survived, and what you believed. For ordinary women, bedtime was survival in its simplest form. After long hours of spinning, cooking, or hauling water, lying down, even on straw, was a kind of small mercy. Their routines were practical. Bank the fire, hush the animals, tuck the children in, and whisper a prayer. Nothing glamorous, but in that repetition was security. Bedtime marked the line between one exhausting day and the next. For nuns and religious women, bedtime was devotion. Their sleep was fragmented by bells and chants, but that was the point. To be tired was to be holy. Their night was not their own, it belonged to God. They lay down not to rest, but to discipline the body and humble the spirit. A hard pillow, a thin blanket, and long hours of prayer were their version of a royal canopy. For queens and noblewomen, bedtime was theatre. The bed was a stage where power, wealth, and anxiety all played out. Whether it was a courtly ritual with attendants or the silent pacing of an insomniac queen, their nights showed the strain of living as symbols, not just people. Draped in silk or weighed down by jewels, they carried politics even into their dreams. But despite the differences, there were constants. Faith was everywhere. Almost every woman, from shepherd's daughter to empress, ended the day with some kind of prayer, asking for safety, for protection from demons, for healthy children, or simply for peace of mind. The night was uncertain and mysterious. Darkness meant danger, both physical and spiritual. Faith was the nightlight of the Middle Ages, and then there was fear, of sickness, of bad dreams, of death in the night. Even the richest bed couldn't keep out the vulnerability that came with closing your eyes. A peasant feared wolves and hunger. A queen feared poison and betrayal. Different worries, same sleeplessness. But there was also comfort. Families huddled together, warmth shared between bodies. Women whispered bedtime stories, sang lullabies, or traced protective signs over children. In the stillness, away from work and ritual, came rare moments of intimacy and tenderness. Even queens, hemmed in by politics, sometimes found peace in small rituals. Candied fruit before bed, a favourite prayer, a loyal servant smoothing her covers. And finally, bedtime was identity. The way a woman ended her day reflected who she was, where she belonged, and what power, or lack of it, she held. A candle lit in a peasant's hut, a psalm whispered in a convent, a velvet curtain drawn around a royal bed, all different, but all human. So, as we close the door on the medieval night, what do we find? Women who are practical, anxious, faithful, sometimes pampered, often exhausted. Women who found meaning in small rituals, who carried the burdens of survival, duty or politics right up to the edge of sleep. And in a way, maybe not much has changed. We still light our rooms, sip our teas, scroll our distractions and wrestle with restless thoughts. The beds are softer now, the pyjamas comfier, but the quiet moments before sleep, still strangely universal. So tonight, as you lie down, maybe think of them. The queen with her silk sheets, the nun with her wooden cell, the peasant with her crowded straw mat. All of them closing their eyes, hoping the night would be kind, and on that note, dim the lights, let the day slip away and drift, just like they did. Good night.